The Society and I, in fact, are delighted to introduce someone with a family link to the Society's past, particularly in our 175th anniversary year, to talk about a genuine pioneer of outdoor access. I invite John Home Robertson to talk about his great uncle, the Reverend AE Robertson. John.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for inspiring me to do some family research, which has been I found fascinating. Right, the Reverend Archibald Aeneas Robertson, otherwise known as AE Robertson, was born in Helensburgh in 1870, died in Edinburgh in 1958. He was a Church of Scotland minister. He was the first person to climb all the 283 Munros summits. He was an accomplished early photographer, as we're about to see. He was chairman, and then in 1941, the president of the Scottish Rights of Way Society. And he was my great uncle, my father's uncle. And I'm very grateful to the Scottish Mountaineering Club for letting me illustrate this story with some of AE Robertson's own photographs, starting with this one. It's a 1910 version of a selfie. You'll see he's pulling a piece of string with his hand. He's in full walking kit, taking a snap of himself with his wife, Kate. He does not look like your typical Edwardian Kirk minister. He looks to be like a rather adventurous individual with a bit of a twinkle in his eye. So I've certainly enjoyed researching his story. So, thank you, Chairman. I'm flattered to be invited to address this 175th anniversary of the AGM of your society. I'm afraid that I can't pretend to be a proper walker. A long retired farmer and politician from Berwickshire, never been a serious walker, but I'm married to an enthusiast. So Catherine and I have done lots of local walks in the borders, and indeed across the border in Northumberland. We've had encounters with English farmers who sometimes use the dreaded phrase, "get off my land." Things a bit different down there. Catherine and I have enjoyed walks and hills all over Scotland on family holidays in Dumfriesshire, Shetland, Barra, the Angus Glens, and lots of places in between. But I'm just a random plodder who's been very, very happy to take advantage of work done by ScotWays to protect and promote access in the Scottish countryside. And incidentally, during my time as constituency MP for East Lothian, I remember successfully dealing with complaints about an incomer who bought an estate in the Lammermuirs and encouraged his staff to harass walkers on an ancient right-of-way. Let's just say that he got the message. That didn't happen again. And of course, I was very happy and very proud to use my vote in the Scottish Parliament to help to entrench our statutory right to roam in the 2003 Land Reform Scotland Act. Now to our subject. Family trees can be full of surprises. I only found out 3 years ago that my father's uncle Archie was Munro completer #1. He died when I was only 10, so I just knew him as an elderly retired Kirk minister who lived in Morningside. He had no children, so I had no cousins there. My dad used to visit him, but astonishingly, my father and his sisters seemed to be completely unaware of their uncle's important mountaineering exploits. What I have done now is to trace my Robertson family tree back to AER's great-great-great-grandfather, George Robertson. He was born in Rothesay in 1692, and he became factor to Lord Bute. The next generations moved to Greenock, and AER's father, another George, was born in Glasgow in 1825. George was described as an insurance broker, and his wife, Catherine Thompson, was from a Greenock shipbuilding family. So we seem to be talking about a middle-class family in the west of Scotland. Highland ancestry may be, but now upwardly mobile urban Scots. Early mortality afflicted all classes in those days. George and Catherine's first son and their only daughter died very young. And then George himself was killed by tuberculosis at the age of 56 in 1881. And I think there should be a family a photograph of the family home at 19 Hillhead Street in Glasgow, between Glasgow University and Great Western Road. Just a short walk from the recently relocated Glasgow Academy. A fairly modest dwelling. It doesn't indicate that they were terribly well off. Their surviving two sons, Harry, my grandfather, and Archie, who we're talking about, were pupils at Glasgow Academy, aged 15 and 11 when George died. And it's worth mentioning that just 1 year later, the 12-year-old Archie climbed Goat Fell on Arran all by himself, not quite a Munro, but a serious Corbett. So early evidence that this Glaswegian lad was interested in Highland walks. Harry, my grandfather, seems to have been the striver of the family. He left school aged 16 and went straight to work and ended up with a very successful business career in Hong Kong on the other side of the world. Archie's career was different. The younger son may have benefited from his widowed mother's inherited wealth. After leaving Glasgow Academy, AER studied physics, then called natural philosophy, under Lord Kelvin at Glasgow University. And then he did divinity at Edinburgh. So he became a Church of Scotland minister, initially as an assistant minister in Musselburgh, then in Edinburgh as Morningside. And in 1906, the age of 36, he got the call to be parish minister at the Braes of Rannoch in Highland Perthshire, a very convenient patch for a walking and climbing enthusiast. So the Robertson brothers went their separate ways as teenagers. Harry was the classic Scotsman on the make, pursuing business interests in Britain's global empire, while Archie was saving souls and bagging Munros back home in Scotland. But they kept in touch with each other, and they both married McFarlane girls, daughters of a family with a strong Highland heritage and a very honourable record of promoting access in our hills and glens. And here's Archie's photograph of his brother, my grandfather, proposing to my grandmother at Ardoonan in Dumbartonshire in 1898. It's a nice pose picture, I love it. Harry's wife, my grandmother, Harry McFarlane, was descended from John McFarlane, the so-called radical laird of Ballinclerch. He had enraged neighbouring estate owners by supporting Thomas Muir and the so-called radical martyrs in 1820, and above all, by opening his gates to the Campsie Glen for public access in 1785. Hannah's cousin Kate, Archie's first wife, was descended from that laird's brother, so no surprise that she shared Archie's enthusiasm for walks and climbs. My grandmother's diary for the 17th of August 1900 in Hong Kong reads, and I quote, "Mail in, news that Archie is going to marry Kate McCaff. Harry thinks he's mad, she's 20 years older than him," end of quote. He might also have mentioned that the couple's mothers were sisters. So in view of that degree of consanguinity, it's probably just as well that Kate was 50 years old and they didn't have any children. Anyway, regardless of the age difference, they evidently had a happy marriage. And Kate, a daughter of the manse, knew how to support Archie's parish work, and she obviously enjoyed sharing his walks and climbs in the Highlands. And here's his picture of Kate beside Loch Arkaig, taken in 1906. AER must have started to take an interest in hills and glens during his time at university. He climbed his first Munro, Ben Cruachan, age 19, in 1889. Bear in mind that Sir Hugh Munro, who gave his name to all the peaks above 3,000 feet, and who compiled the list of those 283 mountains, didn't actually climb them all. Goodness knows why, but great uncle Archie took it upon himself to become the first ever Munro bagger. He even used the term bagging Munros in his diary. 12 years later, he completed the last ascent of Maeljerrig above Glencoe, where he kissed the summit cairn and then remembered to kiss his new wife, who had climbed the mountain with him. We Robertsons are such romantics, you know. Right, that was in 1901. It had taken him 12 years to bag them all, and 22 years passed before the next bagger followed in his footsteps. How times have changed. There are now processions of completers, with nearly 7,000 on the official list. And this summer, Donny Campbell ran up and between all of them in just 31 days. But Archie was the trailblazer. He must have studied Munro's list and located the mountains on Ordnance Survey maps before planning journeys on rough old roads and new railways, because the Mallee line was opened in 1901. Then he had to find routes to previously unclimbed summits. And of course, travel in the Highlands in those days must have been quite exciting. Here's a nice picture of an early improvised Ro-Ro ferry at Kyle Skew. Yes, I like that idea. And of course, Archie and Kate did all that walking, but they also used the tandem bicycle for transit between railway stations and mountains. And here's a nice picture of them with their tandem at Poolew in 1905. AER must have depended very heavily on local knowledge about routes to summits. His diaries and photos also describe Highland hospitality in remote glens. He made an effort to learn Gaelic, not only for travels in the north, but also for his duties as a minister in Highland Perthshire. And here's a couple of portraits of two of his Highland hosts who he stayed with while walking around. Mr. MacPhail at East Monner in 1905, and Mrs. MacDonald spinning outside her house in Glen Strathfara. Archie was the parish minister at Braes of Rannoch from 1907 to 1918, living in the manse at Bridge of Gore. There's a picture that I took of it just a couple of years ago. It's a beautiful and very remote location, halfway between the West Highland railway station at Rannoch and Struan on the main Inverness line, so quite convenient for a keen walker. And of course, Struan happens to be the ancestral heartland of Clan Robertson. I have inherited documents relating to AER's election by the parish of Braes of Rannoch. That call is signed by 97 Kirk members from cottages as well as shooting lodges. And it's fair to assume that he must have been an inspiring preacher, and he and Kate must have provided pastoral support to grieving families all the way through the First World War, and indeed during the 1918 flu pandemic, which we're remembering now. He seems to have been a good fundraiser too. He set himself the task of building a new church to replace a dilapidated old structure, and he succeeded in raising £800 to build the attractive little stone kirk that's still in use today. But his weekday duties to such a small flock can't have been too demanding, leaving plenty of time for walking and mountaineering throughout the Highlands. And here's a photo of the interior of the church. The communion table that you can see at the far end is a nice example of Archie's amateur woodwork and hand carving, which evidently became a serious hobby, including a table made for the Charles Ingalls Clark Mountain Refuge on Ben Nevis in 1929, which is still in use today. And this photograph of the construction is quite an interesting one. Took a horse to transport the materials to site. That's it under construction in 1929, and AER did the dedication service for that hut. And next, to demonstrate the need for that shelter, we should have a photograph of Archie's wife and her friend Effie on the summit plateau of Ben Nevis in April 1906. They were quite intrepid climbers, and shelter was required. AER retired from his parish ministry in Perthshire in 1918, after only 12 years, aged just 49, and returned to Morningside in Edinburgh, where he just had part-time duties as chaplain to the Astley Ainsley Hospital. I can only assume that he had had the advantage of income from his mother's inheritance, because she died in 1898, because he spent a long 40-year retirement on more walking excursions, as well as very active membership of this society and the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and of course the Scottish Mountaineering Club. I've been mentioning and showing some of Archie's photographs. which are a truly magnificent record of landscapes and people in the Highlands at the end of the Victorian area. His glass slides now belong to the Scottish Mountaineering Club, and they are a wonderful archive of images from those times. It would have been difficult enough to scramble up rain-soaked Munros wearing sodden woolen tweed clothes and leather tackety boots, but remember, he was also carrying a bulky, heavy wooden camera and tripod with fragile glass photographic plates too, not to mention a barometer provided by his old professor, Lord Kelvin, to check the altitude of the summits. And here's a wee selection of photographs, starting with his picture of fellow climber Lamont Howie with a tripod and a similar camera. And next, there's a lovely landscape or seascape of the Crofting Township at Ardtoe in Moydart in 1906. And then some action pictures of crofters cutting hay and women gutting herring in Stornoway. Good stuff. AER was president of the Scottish Mountaineering Club from 1929 to 1932. He enjoyed the company of serious mountaineers at SMC meets, and he did some difficult climbs on rock and ice, including the more challenging Munros, as well as an ascent of the Matterhorn in Switzerland in 1908. And here's a picture that he took of fellow climbers practicing on the Salisbury Crag on Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh in 1906. Interesting view. I think it's the Dumby Dykes. That's near where the Scottish Parliament is now in the background. Obviously, his standout mountaineering status was that of Munro Completer #1. But surely his work with the Scottish Rights of Way Society, now ScotWays, to protect and promote rights of access in our countryside has been equally important. Now, as an old red myself, I have to acknowledge the fact that Great Uncle Archie was a true blue Tory. A minister of the established church, the son of a conservative middle-class family, and a natural proponent of the rights and privileges of private landowners. But he had a radical streak in him on the subject of access to the countryside. He built up an extensive knowledge of historic drove roads, coffin paths, and rights of way, and he opposed initiatives by factors of old and new landowners to obstruct those rights. That's why he got involved in the Scottish Rights of Way Society. Now, I'm sure you all know that the Trespass Scotland Act of 1865 only applied to camping and lighting fires. It never had the scope of the legislation and precedents that still apply in England. Signs saying trespassers will be prosecuted in Scotland were always a meaningless bluff. But that didn't stop Scottish landowners from taking steps to obstruct walkers in some places by locking gates, erecting aggressive signs, and by deploying estate staff to frighten people away. Your society was founded in 1845 to resist such tactics and to protect long-established walking routes. AER was elected as a director of the society in 1923, and he became chairman in 1931. Then, as now, there was obviously an important job to be done to resist obstructive lairds, as well as repairing bridges and erecting signposts. After years spent tramping so many paths, AE Robertson knew the facts about routes and rights. His encyclopedic knowledge is demonstrated in his splendid little booklet, I think published by your society, entitled Old Tracks, Cross-Country Routes and Coffin Roads in the Northwest Highlands, published in 1941 during the Second World War. Armed with those facts, he seems to have had the personality to face down bullying landlords and their factors, and he may have been the right man to do it. As a Kirk minister, paid up Tory, and somebody who'd volunteered as a special constable during the general strike in 1926, he probably had more influence with lairds and their factors than a firebrand socialist would have had, but they still found him extremely irritating. Let me just quote two introductory paragraphs from his little booklet. Quote, information about cross-country routes and coffin roads in the Highlands will, be of increasing interest and value to those who want to leave the tarmac and feel the heather under their heel. In the course of my misspent life, I've picked up a considerable amount of such information, and it's but right that this should be set down on paper, else some of it may be lost. Ignorance is what some of the Highland proprietors and many of their factors count on. "You know too much, Mr. Robertson," said a well-known factor playfully to me one day in Inverness. "What I'd like to do is to stick a knife in your ribs and tumble you into a peat hole. Then all that information you have would perish with you. It's to help to combat that eventuality that this article has been written." End of quote. So, the Reverend Archie, the man who knew too much, wrote those details for the benefit of walkers for all time. And that information, together with his personality, helped your society to reopen and protect many Highland walking routes. AER's booklet describing ancient routes throughout the Northwest is still worth reading today. There's little snippets of history as well. It's good stuff. And I must also recommend the book entitled The First Munroist by Peter Drummond and Ian Mitchell, all about AE Robertson, with lots of photographs and excellent accounts of his walks and climbs, as well as his activities with the Society and the Scottish Mountaineering Club. I'm afraid the book's out of print, but it can be obtained in various sort of second-hand sources. Good stuff. Archie had a long and happy retirement at his house in Cluny Gardens in Edinburgh. I'm puzzled by the fact that a man from an apparently modest middle-class background managed to live such a leisurely and comfortable life, including trips to the USA and Italy in the 1890s, as well as countless recreational excursions around Scotland, with presumably very limited income from just 12 years service as minister in a tiny Highland parish and temporary duties in other parishes. I could only assume that there was a magic money tree somewhere, perhaps his mother's inheritance. Archie's first wife died in 1935. Kate had been 20 years older than him and evidently a wonderful companion, as well as a fellow traveller in the hills and glens. But within a year of her death, our 65-year-old widower was married to another keen hill walker, Winifred Hutchison. And here she is, looking very fetching, again, in the hills. And this time his wife was 20 years younger than him. He died aged 88, leaving his mountaineering archive and a wonderful collection of early photographic plates for the Scottish Mountaineering Club, as well as a valuable body of information and rights protected for the benefit of people who enjoy access to Scotland's hills and glens today. And here's a final photograph of the grand old man with his bonnet on the hills. I'm rather proud of the achievements of my great uncle and your former president. Thank you very much for listening to this story about him in your Society's 175th anniversary year. I'm sure he'd be delighted to find that ScotWays is still going well and strong. And equally, I'm sure he'd be absolutely astonished by the technology that makes it possible for us to have a virtual meeting like this. Thank you very much.